So I'm hoping that this is going to be a fairly brief lecture on Kevin Clark's third chapter. The third chapter is called The Sound of Contemporary Poetry, which is one of your reading assignments for this week. And it's from his book published in 2007 called The Mind's Eye, A Guide to Poetry Writing. So what I want to do in this lecture is I want to talk about summaries, important aspects of this chapter or article, and considerations for further thinking and your own note taking. So normally what I do when I'm in a classroom, and this is our version of a classroom, is I will summarize the material that we are going over. And I do that because summarizing is very important in all manners of your education and your work. And I even suggest it's important on a personal level. So summarizing is also a common writing assignment in most university courses. It refers to just summarizing a particular piece of material or even a lab outcome. You have probably come across this type of assignment, but if you are unfamiliar with it in a university context, it is also a feature in everyday life. So just think like when someone says to you, are you familiar with, I don't know, the television series that's just been released from HBO called Raised by Wolves? And then they might then summarize it for you. And depending on what they're like with summarizing, it could be a good summary or a bad summary. So there are three main requirements. A summary should cover the original, the entire material as a whole. The material should be presented in a neutral fashion. That means you and what you think of it should be absent. It should be a condensed version of the material that is also presented in your own words. Normally, there are no quotations. It's only paraphrasing. And often with summaries, they're often very short, like one paragraph, like about 350 words. So notice how the summary begins by identifying the writer, the book, and the chapter, as well as when it was first released, which is just its publication date. I indicate straight away the theme and how Kevin Clark breaks down his chapter, as well as how he closes it. Summaries are normally one paragraph, and they don't normally have verbatim quotations. Verbatim is a fancy word for word. So you're not going to see any citations normally in a summary. And also what you're not seeing is any opinion or any emotion or any kind of thoughts of what I think of it. It has an appearance of objectivity. I want to begin looking at, of course, the important aspects of the article or the chapter, but I initially want to begin with two quotes. Both of these are from page 40 of Kevin Clark's chapter, and this first quote we're looking at is important because Kevin Clark briefly provides a rough sketch of the changes in poetry post 1918, and that's the end of World War I. He introduces one of the most famous of the Beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, and also Ginsberg's poem Howl. And you'll be reading and listening to that in an upcoming class, as well as how this poet changed the face of poetry in the late 1950s. The second quote I think is important because he's really telling you what he wants to look at. And he's talking about contemporary poets, that's just modern day poets, us, are generally divided into two camps. And he's dividing poets into two camps, talkers and singers. And he says that the talkers prefer a realistic, conversational type of speech that approximates the way people communicate with one another on a daily basis. This conversational style can help the writer cozy up to a reader as if the poet and reader were old friends. The diction, fancy word for word choice, is fairly straightforward, nothing fancy. And the phrasing is often subtle, but in order to create the illusion of intimacy or friendship, the poet usually wants to de emphasize any sonic sound fireworks. Then you try this style of expression, try to keep the lines relatively short in order to avoid sounding prosaic, like regular prose. So he's talking about this idea that there's a camp of poets that are talker poets, and that they want to reimagine the conversational style in everyday speech, which I think is quite interesting. I've actually never really thought of it this way, so I'm interested by what he's doing with this idea of talkers and singers. And of course, the first quote where he talks about Allen Ginsberg and the way Howell revolutionized the poetics of the 20th century is really important because it's a free verse poem. It's not rhyming, and it moves in so many directions. But we'll come to that in a later class. So Kevin Clark is asserting that those poets that are talkers can create poetry. A list: conversational style sentences, conventional syntax, subject plus verb plus direct object, straightforward diction, subtle sounds. And on page 41, he says this talking style of poetry keeps the lines short, and the lines are kept short to avoid sounding like regular prose. So I'm going to move along fairly quickly. This is just a breakdown of the chapter. Clark's indicates that talking poems tend to be slower because they are less sonic. That is, they're less musically rich to the ear. But not always. There are various ways of actually slowing poems down, other than making them, as he would call them, talking poems. So you can use technical aspects if you wanted to slow a poem down. So for example, a caesura, which is a fancy word for a pause or interruption in a poem mid-line. So for example, oh, a long time, the boys said. Those commas create a caesura along with that, the phrase, a long time. So it's forcing you to interrupt, to pause. Again, punctuation will affect rhythm and can often add slowness. We just saw that with the caesura, with the commas. Periods, commas, semicolons, and the like used in the line, as well as lines that are end stopped with periods, commas, semicolons, will often force a pause. Repetitions of certain sounds might slow a line and an entire poem down. For example, assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds in words that begin with different consonants. And again, for assonance to work, you need to remember that you have to keep the words close enough to one another to resonate for our ear to hear the connection in that sound. He goes on to talk about how singing poets often can construct or do construct poems that sing. And he lists things like internal rhyme, alliteration, slant rhyme, repetition of words and or phrases, emphasis of hard sounds, that's a consonants, and of course, what we've just looked at, acid. So here I've broken down what these things mean. So I give you in the brackets a definition of, just a moment. Sorry, I give you a definition of, for example, what internal rhyme is, what alliteration is, slant rhyme, so that you know what these things mean. as well as that they can often be utilized to move a poem along, that it gives it kind of a trotting or a speediness to it. Clark goes on to talk about other sonic or sound devices. Enjambment, which is it's a technique in poetry where a sentence is carried over from one line to the next. It it kind of like pushes you along. So an example is to Diane and me, the slaps and shudders looked a lot like pain. So it's almost like you don't pause at the end of the line. You just keep moving. To see this sort of tugging effect of enjambment, consider Rebecca Fredrickson's Cat Skinner, and that's a poem listed for you to read this week. And then there are, of course, other things that can add speed or kind of like a quicker effect in poetry, run-on sentences, a consistent use of conjunctions, liberal use of enjambment, that kind of like pushing the reader along, various types of interior rhyming, and quick associative referencing. He also has a section about how we talk back home. That's what he has called it. And in that section, he talks about colloquial or vernacular ways of speaking. And those are just like a way of speaking in a local area. And I suggest to you that every area has its own kind of vernacular, its own kind of way of communicating. Um, to kind of really draw your attention to it, I guess in Canada, it would be easy to point out Newfoundland, but BC and even the regions of BC, I think, have their own specific accents and kind of speech and vernacular. There are poems that we will be considering in our course that definitely do that. For example, Old Tongue and Mr. and Mrs. Scotland Are Dead. And then Kevin Clark provides a number of exercises that actually kind of work you through the chapter and what he's talking about. Obviously, if you're inclined, you can certainly do them, but they're not assigned to you. So that's completely up to you. So this has been just a brief kind of breakdown of his chapter, the assigned reading, one of the assigned readings for you this week. And thank you and take care.